The newspaper delivery man called 911 upon seeing the elderly man in a miserable condition. As the paramedics stormed into the house, the neighbors watched and murmured. But when the man's son arrived in the neighborhood, everyone's reaction was one of complete shock. The sun had barely begun to rise as Daniel pedaled his bike down the quiet streets. The air was cold, and his breath formed small clouds in front of his face. He adjusted the weight of his heavy backpack, which was filled with newspapers that he needed to deliver before the day properly started. Daniel had grown used to this routine. Wake up before everyone, toss on the same worn-out sneakers, and bike through the silent neighborhood. It was his way of helping his parents pay bills. He knew they were struggling, especially after his mom talked about needing extra shifts, and his dad spent nights working at the warehouse. He turned onto Sycamore Street. The familiar houses lined up in their usual sleepy state. Most of the residents were still inside, probably sipping coffee or getting ready for their day, unaware of the kid on his bike making sure their morning paper was at the door. As he approached Mr. Grayson's house, Daniel slowed down. The old man's place always stood out to him. The bricks were worn, the windows looked dusty, and the yard was overgrown. He tossed a paper towards the front door, like he did every morning, but then he noticed something strange. The door wasn't fully shut. It was cracked open, barely hanging there, and behind it, Mr. Grayson was standing in the doorway. He looked frail, more than usual. His thin frame seemed to sway as he struggled to stay standing. His eyes were sunken, his clothes looked 2 sizes too big, and he was gripping the doorframe like he might fall over. Mr. Grayson? Daniel called, hesitating. He let the bike stop next to the sidewalk. The old man didn't respond at first. His eyes drifted to Daniel, but they seemed vacant, like he wasn't quite seeing him. Hey, Mr. Grayson, Daniel tried again, louder this time. He walked closer, leaving his bike leaning against the mailbox. You good, man? You need something? Mr. Grayson just stared. His lips parted and he mumbled something, but it was too quiet for Daniel to catch. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the smell too. The house had a staleness, a deep, sour smell that made Daniel wrinkle his nose. Daniel looked past him into the house. The darkness inside seemed thick, and he noticed piles of garbage, old newspapers, and food wrappers cluttering the hallway. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just an old man living alone. This was something worse. Daniel's heart started pounding. He glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone, a neighbor maybe, but the street was empty. He turned back to Mr. Grayson, whose breathing sounded shallow. Daniel could see the way his shoulders moved, weak and trembling. Mr. Grayson, Daniel said, his voice firmer now. I think you need some help. You want me to call someone? The old man didn't answer. He just took a shaky step backward, his hand slipping from the doorframe for a second before he caught it again. Daniel felt a chill run through his spine. He wasn't sure what to do, but leaving the old man like this seemed wrong. He took a deep breath and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled for the emergency number. He pressed the call button. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end sounded calm. Daniel looked at Mr. Grayson, who now seemed to slump further, almost collapsing on himself. Yeah, there's this guy. He doesn't look good. He's old, and, I think he needs help. He's at his house. It's, Sycamore Street, number 42, Daniel stammered. Is he conscious? The dispatcher asked. Yeah, but he's not. I don't know, he's not right. He looks sick, like, really sick, Daniel said, watching as Mr. Grayson's head started to tilt, his grip weakening. All right, we're sending paramedics. Stay there if you can, okay? Yeah, okay, Daniel said, ending the call. He pocketed the phone and took a step towards Mr. Grayson. Hey, they're coming, okay? Just hang in there, all right? Daniel said, his voice a bit shaky. Mr. Grayson didn't respond, but he seemed to relax a little, as if the words reached him somewhere deep. Daniel stood there, feeling the coldness of the early morning start to bite into his skin. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, and he couldn't help but feel that maybe he was doing something wrong. He shouldn't be here, calling for help, bringing all this attention. But then again, what else could he do? He couldn't just ride away and pretend everything was fine. Minutes felt like hours. The street was empty until finally he heard the distant wail of a siren. Daniel looked up, spotting the flashing lights as an ambulance turned onto Sycamore Street. He waved, signaling them down, as they pulled up in front of the house. 2 paramedics jumped out, rushing towards Mr. Grayson, who now looked like he was on the verge of collapsing. They spoke to him in calm voices, asking questions as they supported his frail body and began leading him towards the gurney. Daniel stepped back, watching, unsure of what to do. He glanced around and noticed neighbors peeking out from behind curtains or standing in their doorways. Whispers started to travel, and Daniel felt a prickling on his skin. He was suddenly very aware of the eyes on him. "Is he going to be all right?" Daniel asked one of the paramedics, his voice low. The paramedic nodded but didn't make eye contact. "We'll take care of him, son. You did the right thing calling us." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding, but he still felt uneasy. He watched as they loaded Mr. Grayson into the ambulance. The old man's eyes caught his for a second, and there was something there. Something like gratitude, maybe, or fear. It was hard to tell. The ambulance doors shut, and they drove away, leaving Daniel alone on the street, still feeling the weight of what had just happened. He turned, realizing now how many neighbors had come out to watch. They stared at him, some with curiosity, others with looks he couldn't quite read, maybe disapproval. Daniel picked up his bike, suddenly wanting to leave. He hopped on and pedaled away, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow he had crossed an invisible line. Daniel spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off the unease from what happened. He continued with his newspaper route, tossing papers onto doorsteps, but he couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Grayson. The way he looked, so weak, so lost, and then the way the neighbors stared at Daniel like he'd done something wrong. As he reached the end of his deliveries, Daniel thought he might head home. He was tired and, honestly, just wanted to be away from everyone for a bit. But as he turned back onto Sycamore Street, he saw it. An ambulance was parked in front of Mr. Grayson's house, lights still flashing but the siren off now. A police car had joined it, and a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk. There was a nervous energy in the air. People whispered to each other, eyes glued to the scene. Daniel hesitated, slowing down his bike. He wasn't sure if he should get closer, but something about it pulled him in. He saw the paramedics moving around inside the house. They were coming out with Mr. Grayson now, placing him onto a gurney. He stopped his bike near the curb, trying to stay out of sight but also wanting to see what was happening. He caught snippets of conversations from the neighbors. "Looks like something's finally happened in that house," one woman murmured to her friend, her arms crossed as she watched. "About time someone checked on him. The old man's been off for years," the other replied. Daniel frowned, feeling his stomach tighten. He hadn't meant to make a scene, but now it felt like everyone was involved. He could feel their judgment, like they were blaming him for what was going on. "Hey, isn't that the kid who delivers the papers?" someone said, and Daniel felt eyes shift towards him. He wanted to shrink, to disappear, but he just gave a short nod. "Yeah, I called for help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't even sure why he felt the need to say anything, but he did. Another neighbor, an older man, glanced at Daniel with a frown. "Didn't think it was any of your business, kid," he said, shaking his head. "Grayson always kept to himself." Daniel blinked, feeling heat rise in his face. He wanted to argue, say something back, but nothing came out. Instead, he just stared as the paramedics loaded Mr. Grayson into the ambulance, securing him on the gurney. He looked even smaller now, almost swallowed by the white sheets. "Excuse me," one of the paramedics said, approaching Daniel. "You're the one who made the call?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I saw him. He didn't look right. He was like barely standing there." "You did good, kid. We're going to get him checked out," the paramedic said. He gave Daniel a nod before heading back to the ambulance. The crowd started to thin out as the ambulance pulled away, but Daniel stayed, his feet rooted to the sidewalk. He didn't know why, but he couldn't leave just yet. He looked around at the neighbors, who were still murmuring amongst themselves. A few glanced at him, then quickly turned away. Suddenly, someone spoke right next to him. "You really called them, huh?" It was Mrs. Campbell, one of the neighbors who had always been polite but distant. She had her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Daniel looked at her and shrugged. "I mean, I thought he needed help. He looked bad." Mrs. Campbell sighed, shaking her head. "People like Mr. Grayson, they don't want help, boy. They want to be left alone." Daniel frowned, unsure how to respond. He looked back at the now empty doorway of Mr. Grayson's house. The door was wide open, revealing the mess inside. It looked dark, hollow, like it hadn't seen light or life in ages. He swallowed hard. "I couldn't just leave him like that." "Maybe not, but now everyone's talking," Mrs. Campbell said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's not always good to stick your nose in, you know." Daniel clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. He wanted to yell at her, to tell her she was wrong, but his words stuck. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the doorway. "Anyway, just be careful. People don't forget things like this," she added, before turning and walking away. Daniel watched her leave, her words echoing in his head. He didn't get it. He thought he'd done the right thing, but the way people talked, the way they looked at him, it was like he'd made a mistake. He kicked at a loose stone on the sidewalk, frustrated. He turned back to his bike, deciding he'd had enough for today. He just wanted to go home, where no one could look at him like that. As he rode away, he kept glancing over his shoulder. He felt like everyone was watching him, like every pair of eyes on Sycamore Street was following his every move. It was suffocating. His heart beat faster with each turn of the pedals and his legs ached, but he didn't slow down until he was far from the street, away from the whispers and the judgment. Finally, he arrived home, dropping his bike on the front lawn. He pushed through the front door, and his mom looked up from the kitchen. "You're back early," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yeah," Daniel mumbled, avoiding her eyes. He walked straight to his room, shutting the door behind him. He flopped onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The weight of everything settled on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He replayed the scene in his head, the looks on the neighbors' faces, the ambulance, Mr. Grayson's hollow eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd messed up. Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand and he reached for it, expecting maybe a message from a friend. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering. "Hello? Is this Daniel?" The voice was deep, unfamiliar. Yeah, who's this?" "This is John Grayson. My father was just taken to the hospital. I understand you were the one who called." Daniel sat up, his stomach twisting. "Yeah, he didn't look right. I thought he needed help." There was a pause on the other end, and Daniel could hear a shaky breath. "You did good, kid. I'm thankful you called. I live a couple of hours away, and I haven't been able to check on him like I should. You might have saved his life." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Yeah, okay," he said, not knowing what else to say. The gratitude in the man's voice made him feel both better and worse. He'd helped, sure, but the scene he'd caused, the whispers, it all still hung over him. "Thank you, Daniel," John said again before hanging up. Daniel put the phone down, staring at it for a moment. He lay back down, trying to process everything. He'd saved Mr. Grayson, maybe even his life, but somehow it still felt wrong. He closed his eyes, the exhaustion from the morning catching up to him. All he wanted was for the day to be over, to forget the way the neighbors looked at him and the way Mrs. Campbell's words stung. The next morning, Daniel forced himself to get up and get ready for his paper route. He stared at himself in the mirror, splashing cold water on his face. His eyes were heavy from a restless night, and there was a knot in his stomach that didn't seem to go away. But he knew he had to keep moving. His family relied on the little bit of money he made. He grabbed his backpack, now filled with the day's newspapers, and stepped out into the cold air. The early morning was quieter than usual, or maybe it was just that he felt more alone than ever. He tried to push the feeling aside, hopping onto his bike and heading for his route. When he reached the first house, he tossed the newspaper onto the porch like always, the satisfying thump echoing through the still air. Everything felt normal until he approached the third house on the route, Mrs. Campbell's. He slowed his bike, already expecting her coldness, but when he got closer, she wasn't there. Instead, the door was firmly closed, the curtains drawn tight. Daniel hesitated for a moment before tossing the newspaper towards her porch. The paper landed with a soft thud, and he waited, expecting to hear the creak of the door, or at least see some movement from inside. But nothing happened. Mrs. Campbell didn't come out. She always used to wave or nod. Today, she didn't even peek out. He shrugged, trying to convince himself it didn't matter, but it did. Further down the street, at another familiar house, Mr. Larson's, things were different too. Daniel knocked, but nobody answered. He knocked again, louder, waiting. Mr. Larson used to be one of the first people to greet him, always with a warm smile, sometimes with a cup of coffee in hand. But now Daniel just heard the muffled sound of footsteps on the other side of the door, pausing, and then fading away. Guess he's not home, Daniel muttered to himself, but deep down he knew it wasn't that simple. The door hadn't even opened a crack, and the curtains had been pulled tight. Something felt off, and he knew it was all because of yesterday. He continued down the route, dropping newspapers off at each house. As he moved further along, he started to notice a pattern. More closed doors, more curtains drawn. People that usually exchanged a few words with him suddenly weren't opening their doors at all. He felt each rejection like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. By the time he finished his route, Daniel felt like he could hardly breathe. He knew he shouldn't care. He had done the right thing. Mr. Grayson needed help, and Daniel had been the only one willing to step up. But now, he was paying the price for it. The silence from the neighborhood felt suffocating. Daniel rode his bike back towards home, the wind cold against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was on everything that had happened in the past day. He could see the way the neighbors had looked at him, the disappointment in their eyes, as if he'd broken some unspoken rule. It made him feel smaller than ever. Once home, he left his bike on the front lawn and walked inside. His mom was in the kitchen, cooking breakfast. She looked up as he walked in. "Morning, sweetheart. You look tired," she said, her voice filled with concern. "Didn't sleep well?" Daniel shrugged, dropping his bag onto the floor. "I'm fine, Mom. It was a long morning." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "Is it about that man you helped yesterday? I heard some people talking about it." She turned back to the stove, flipping a pancake. Daniel sighed, leaning against the counter. "Yeah. I think I did the right thing, you know. He needed help. But now, it's like everyone's mad at me for it. People didn't open their doors today." His mom looked at him, her expression softening. She put down the spatula and walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You did what you thought was right, Daniel. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't make people happy. But that doesn't mean it wasn't right." Daniel nodded, but the words didn't really help. He appreciated her trying, but the weight of everyone's silence still hung over him. He wished he could just let it go, but it was hard. He looked at his mom, noticing the tired lines around her eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. They were struggling enough as it was. He didn't need to make things worse by getting himself into trouble. "Thanks, Mom," he said, managing a small smile. She smiled back, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before returning to the stove. Daniel grabbed his backpack and headed to his room, dropping onto his bed. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind, but all he could see was Mr. Grayson's face, the hollow look in his eyes, the way his hand had trembled as he held onto the doorframe. It was like the image was burned into his memory. His phone buzzed, startling him out of his thoughts. He picked it up and saw a call from an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat, and he hesitated before answering. "Hello?" he said, his voice wary. "Daniel?" It was the deep voice from yesterday, Mr. Grayson's son, John. "I wanted to thank you again. You really saved my father's life. I just wanted you to know that." Daniel swallowed, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, thanks," he replied, unsure what else to say. There was a pause, and Daniel heard John take a deep breath. "Listen, I know it might have caused you some trouble, with the neighbors and all. I'm really sorry about that. But I want you to know you did the right thing. My father, he's had a hard time and I couldn't be there. What you did means a lot to me." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He didn't know why, but the gratitude in John's voice almost made him feel worse. "It's okay. I just did what anyone would have done, right?" he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "No, not anyone," John replied. "Most people would have walked away. You didn't. That matters." Daniel nodded, even though John couldn't see him. "Thanks," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. They hung up and Daniel sat there, staring at the phone in his hand. He had saved someone's life. He should feel good about that, but instead, he felt this heaviness in his chest that wouldn't go away. He wanted to feel proud, to feel like he'd done something important, but all he could think about was the way the neighbors had looked at him, the way Mrs. Campbell's voice sounded when she said he shouldn't have gotten involved. A soft knock came at his door, and his mom poked her head in. "Hey, you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. Daniel looked up at her and forced a smile. "Yeah, Mom, I'm fine," he lied. She nodded, though she looked unconvinced. "All right, just remember, we're proud of you no matter what. You did something brave." Daniel managed another smile as she closed the door. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he'd messed everything up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets. Daniel grabbed his bike, the newspapers already loaded in his backpack, and headed out for another day of deliveries. He tried to ignore the knot in his stomach, the anxious feeling that had been growing since yesterday. He hoped maybe today would be different. He began his usual route, the houses familiar, but something still felt off. He tried to keep his focus on the deliveries. Get in, get out. He tossed papers onto the porches, listening to the dull thump each time they landed. But every so often, he would catch a curtain move, a quick flash of someone's face, and then it would vanish. It was like they were all watching him, but no one wanted to be seen. As he neared Mrs. Campbell's house, he could already feel his heart rate picking up. Her door was still closed, the curtains drawn tight. He paused for a second, wondering if he should even bother knocking, but he did it anyway. Out of habit, out of hope, he wasn't sure. He knocked twice and waited. Silence. He turned away, shaking his head. "Whatever," he muttered to himself, moving on to the next house. But deep down it hurt. He had always thought Mrs. Campbell liked him, at least a little, but now it seemed like she didn't even want to look at him, It made his chest feel tight. At the next house, Mr. Larson's, Daniel knocked again, this time louder. There was a pause, then the door creaked open just a crack, enough for Mr. Larson to peer through. He looked at Daniel, his expression guarded. "Morning, Mr. Larson," Daniel said, trying to sound normal, casual. Mr. Larson didn't smile. He just looked at Daniel for a moment before opening the door a bit wider. "Yeah, morning," he said, his voice flat. He took the newspaper from Daniel's hand, then quickly shut the door without another word. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. He felt his face flush, a mix of embarrassment and anger bubbling up inside him. He wanted to bang on the door, to ask Mr. Larson what he'd done wrong, why everyone was treating him like this. But instead, he just turned away, getting back on his bike. He rode down the street, the air cold against his face, and tried to ignore the stares he felt from behind the windows. It was like everyone had decided he wasn't welcome anymore. And for what? For helping someone? It didn't make sense. He stopped at the next house, dropping the newspaper onto the porch without even bothering to knock. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He just wanted to get this over with. As he rode away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whole neighborhood was against him, like he was some kind of outsider now. He finished his route and headed home, his thoughts heavy. When he reached his house, he found his dad sitting on the porch, a stack of bills in his hand, his face lined with stress. Daniel got off his bike, leaning it against the railing. "Morning, Dad," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. His dad looked up, giving him a tired smile. "Morning, kid. How was the route?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "It was fine," he lied. He didn't want to add more stress to his dad's already full plate. His dad nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Good. Listen, I've been thinking we might need to cut back a bit more. Things are tight and, well, you know how it is." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew things were bad, but hearing it out loud made it feel even worse. He wanted to help, to do more, but delivering newspapers was the only thing he had. He forced a nod. "Yeah, I get it, Dad. I'll do what I can." His dad sighed, reaching out to ruffle Daniel's hair. "You're a good kid, Daniel. I know it's not easy." Daniel managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's all right," he said, even though it didn't feel all right at all. He went inside, dropping his bag by the door and heading to his room. He needed a moment to breathe, to think. He lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. Everything felt like it was crumbling around him. The neighbors, the bills, the looks they gave him. It was all too much. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He picked it up, seeing a message from an unknown number. He frowned, opening it. "Daniel, this is John Grayson. My father is doing better. I wanted to thank you again. It means a lot." Daniel read the message twice, then set his phone down. He should have felt good about it. He'd helped someone. He'd done the right thing. But all he could think about was the way Mr. Larson had looked at him, the way Mrs. Campbell had ignored him. It was like none of it mattered. He got up, pacing his room. He wanted to do something, anything to shake the feeling that was gnawing at him. He thought about going back out, maybe just riding his bike for a while, but then he heard a knock at the front door. He opened his door a crack, peeking out. His mom was already at the door talking to someone. He couldn't see who it was, but he could hear the voice. "Mr. Larson, I just wanted to let you know," Mr. Larson was saying, his voice low, "that maybe your boy should keep to himself a bit more. Folks around here don't like their business being messed with." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He clenched his fists, his heart pounding in his ears. He wanted to burst out of his room, to tell Mr. Larson that he hadn't done anything wrong, but he stayed where he was, frozen. His mom's voice was calm but firm. "My son did what he thought was right, Mr. Larson. I'm proud of him for that." There was a pause, then Mr. Larson's voice, quieter now. "Yeah, well, just thought you should know," he said, and then Daniel heard the door close. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mom stood there for a moment, her hand still on the doorknob. Then she turned and saw Daniel peeking out. "Daniel," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's all right. Don't let them get to you." Daniel stepped out of his room, his hands still clenched at his sides. "Why are they like this, Mom? I was just trying to help." She walked over, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him into a hug. "I know, sweetheart. Some people just don't understand. But you did the right thing. Don't forget that." Daniel closed his eyes, leaning into her. He wanted to believe her, but it was hard. The weight of everyone's judgment still hung over him, heavy and suffocating. He knew he couldn't change their minds, but it didn't make it hurt any less. He pulled away, giving her a small nod. "Yeah. Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. She smiled, brushing his hair back. "Why don't you take a break for a bit? You've been working hard." Daniel nodded again, turning and heading back to his room. He needed to clear his head, to find some way to push all of this aside. He sat on his bed, picking up his phone again, staring at John Grayson's message. He read it one more time, trying to let the words sink in. "You did the right thing." Maybe he had. Maybe it just didn't feel like it right now. He put his phone down, taking a deep breath. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not now. Not after everything he'd done. Daniel lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady his breathing. He had done the right thing, and that had to be enough. He closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion from the morning wash over him. Tomorrow would be another day, and maybe, just maybe, things would be a little better. The sun was bright in the sky, though the air was still cold. Daniel stood outside, his backpack full of newspapers once again. He hesitated for a moment before grabbing his bike. Today felt different, though he didn't know why. He had a weird feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite shake, a mix of anxiety and hope. He pushed off, pedaling down the street to start his deliveries. He was halfway through his route, lost in the rhythm of tossing newspapers, when he noticed the car parked in front of Mr. Grayson's house. It was shiny, expensive. Definitely not the kind of car you usually saw around here. Daniel slowed down, frowning as he looked at it. The car had out-of-state plates, and it seemed out of place among the older, worn-down vehicles that lined the street. Daniel coasted to a stop, his eyes fixed on the house. The front door was open, and a man stood in the doorway. He looked to be in his 30s, well-dressed with sharp features and an expression that was hard to read. Daniel realized who it must be. John Grayson, the son. The man looked up, spotting Daniel on the sidewalk. He stepped forward, raising a hand. "Hey, you're Daniel, right?" Daniel swallowed, nodding slowly. He got off his bike, walking it up to the curb. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice a little uncertain. John smiled, though it seemed tired. He walked down the steps, stopping in front of Daniel. "I've been wanting to meet you. I can't thank you enough for what you did for my dad." Daniel glanced around, noticing that a few of the neighbors had come outside watching. He felt his face flush. I saw he needed help. I didn't really think about it," he said, his voice low. "Well, I'm grateful. He's doing better now. And it's because of you," John said. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to give you this. It's a reward for what you did." Daniel blinked, looking at the envelope. He hesitated, then slowly reached out and took it. It felt heavy in his hand, and he glanced up at John, unsure. Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. John smiled again, a little warmer this time. You're a good kid, Daniel. Not everyone would have done what you did. You should be proud of yourself." Daniel nodded, but he didn't feel proud. He felt exposed, like all the eyes on him were burning holes into his skin. He could see Mrs. Campbell standing at the edge of her yard, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Other neighbors were peeking out from behind curtains, some watching from their porches. He felt like he was on display. "Listen, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out," John said, patting Daniel's shoulder. "You've got my number now. Seriously, anything." "Okay," Daniel said, his voice tight. He wanted to get out of there, away from all the attention. He looked back at John, forcing a small smile. "Thanks again." John nodded, then turned, heading back towards the house. Daniel watched him go, then looked down at the envelope in his hand. He opened it, seeing a stack of bills inside. It was more money than he'd ever held before, and it made his stomach twist. He knew it could help his family, could take some of the pressure off his parents, but it didn't make him feel any better. He shoved the envelope into his backpack, glancing around. The neighbors were still watching, and he felt a flash of anger. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? He turned, getting back on his bike, and pedaled away, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to put as much distance between himself and those prying eyes as possible. He rode for a while, not really paying attention to where he was going. He ended up at the park, a small patch of grass and trees that was usually empty this time of day. He dropped his bike on the grass and sat on a bench, letting out a long breath. He pulled the envelope out of his bag, staring at it. He should have felt good. He had done something right, something that mattered. But all he felt was the weight of the money in his hand, and the judgment of the neighbors, and the fear that maybe he had made everything worse. "Hey, Daniel!" a voice called, and Daniel looked up, startled. He saw his friend Marcus jogging over, a basketball under his arm. Marcus lived a couple of streets over and sometimes joined Daniel on his route if he was up early enough. Daniel tried to smile. "Hey, man." Marcus plopped down on the bench next to him, looking at the envelope in Daniel's hand. "What's that? You get paid or something?" Daniel shook his head, slipping the envelope back into his backpack. "Not exactly. It's from Mr. Grayson's son. For, calling 911 and all that." Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Dude, that's crazy. How much is in there?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. A lot, I guess." He looked down at his hands, the knuckles white from clenching them so tight. Marcus gave him a curious look. "That's a good thing, right? I mean, you helped the old guy, and now you got something for it." Daniel sighed, leaning back on the bench. "Yeah, I guess it's just... I don't know, man. The neighbors, they're acting weird, like I did something wrong." Marcus frowned, shaking his head. "People are stupid. You did the right thing. Who cares what they think?" Daniel looked at his friend, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Marcus grinned, standing up and tossing the basketball in the air. "Of course I'm right. Now come on, let's play some ball. You look like you need it." Daniel hesitated, then nodded, getting up. He left his bike by the bench, following Marcus to the cracked basketball court at the edge of the park. Marcus passed him the ball, and Daniel caught it, feeling some of the tension in his chest start to ease. They played for a while, the sound of the ball echoing against the pavement, the cold air biting at their skin. For a little while, Daniel let himself forget about the neighbors, about Mr. Grayson, about everything. He focused on the game, the way the ball felt in his hands, the way his feet moved across the court. When they finally stopped, both of them out of breath, Daniel felt lighter. He knew the problems were still there, but for now, they didn't feel so heavy. Marcus slapped him on the back. "See? Told you. You just needed to get out of your head for a bit." Daniel laughed, nodding. "Yeah, thanks, man." They walked back to the bench and Daniel grabbed his bike, the envelope still sitting heavy in his backpack. He knew he had to go home, had to face everything again, but at least now it didn't feel quite so impossible. He said goodbye to Marcus and headed home, the sun now high in the sky. As he rode, he thought about what John had said, about being proud of what he'd done. Maybe it would take some time, but Daniel thought he might get there eventually. He reached his house, getting off his bike and walking up the steps. His mom was in the living room folding laundry. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes widening when she saw the envelope he pulled from his bag. "Daniel, what's that?" she asked, setting down the clothes. It's from Mr. Grayson's son. He gave it to me for helping," Daniel said, holding the envelope out to her. She took it, her eyes widening as she looked inside. "Oh my goodness, Daniel. This is a lot of money." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "I know, I thought it could help with the bills and stuff." His mom looked at him, her eyes softening. She reached out, pulling him into a hug. "You're such a good boy, Daniel. You did something brave, and now you're helping us too." Daniel hugged her back, feeling the tension in his chest start to ease, just a little. Maybe he hadn't messed everything up. Maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, the money inside untouched. Daniel's mom was sitting across from it, her eyes on the bills like they were something she could hardly believe was real. She kept touching them, her fingers brushing the edges of the crisp notes like she was afraid they might vanish. Daniel watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame. He could see the thoughts running through her mind, the relief mixed with hesitation. It was a lot of money, but it wouldn't last forever. They'd still have the bills, the rent, the groceries. This was just a temporary relief. His dad was at the other end of the table, his face serious as he looked at the envelope. He took a deep breath, glancing up at Daniel. "You sure about this, son? This is your reward. You don't have to put it all into bills." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure. We need it, Dad. Besides, it's not like I have anything else to spend it on." He tried to sound casual, like it wasn't a big deal, but the truth was it mattered more to him that his parents had a little less to worry about. He couldn't stand seeing the stress on their faces every day. His dad looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, then. We'll use it for the bills." He looked over at Daniel's mom, who gave him a small smile, her eyes a bit shiny. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. She stood up, walking over to Daniel and giving him a hug. "You've always been such a good boy." Daniel hugged her back, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure how he felt. The money was going to help, sure, but it wasn't going to solve everything. The tension in the house wasn't going to vanish overnight, and he knew that. After a moment, his mom let go, wiping her eyes quickly before going back to the table. Daniel stepped back, glancing at the clock. It was getting late, and he knew he still had homework to do, but he couldn't focus. His mind was still tangled up in everything that had happened with Mr. Grayson and the neighbors. He turned, heading to his room, hoping he could at least get some of the assignments done before it got too late. He sat down at his desk, pulling out his notebook, but the words on the page blurred in front of his eyes. He sighed, dropping his head into his hands, trying to push the thoughts away. He needed to focus, but it was like his brain wouldn't stop running in circles. A knock came at his door, and Daniel looked up. His mom peeked in, giving him a soft smile. "You all right, honey?" she asked. Daniel shrugged, turning back to his notebook. "Yeah, just trying to get this done." She stepped inside, her eyes concerned. "You've been through a lot these past few days. You know it's okay to take a break, right? You don't have to carry everything on your own." Daniel looked up at her, his throat tightening. "I know, Mom. I don't want to fall behind. I've already got so much going on, and I don't want to make things worse." She nodded, stepping closer and resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing great, Daniel. I know it doesn't always feel like it, but you are. You're stronger than you realize." Daniel managed a small smile, but he didn't really feel it. He appreciated her trying to make him feel better, but the weight on his shoulders wasn't something that could be lifted with a few kind words. He looked back at his notebook, the numbers and equations still swimming in front of him. "All right," his mom said after a moment, her voice gentle. "I'll let you work. But remember, you don't have to do everything by yourself." She squeezed his shoulder, then turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Daniel let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his head. He knew his mom was right, he didn't have to do everything alone. But it felt like he didn't have much choice. If he didn't do it, who would? He picked up his pencil, trying to focus again, but before he could start, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, seeing a message from Marcus. "Hey man, want to come shoot some hoops?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at his homework. He knew he should stay, should finish what he started. But maybe getting out, even for a little bit, would help clear his head. He stood up, grabbing his jacket and heading out of his room. "Mom, I'm going to go meet Marcus for a bit," he called, grabbing his bike from the front yard. "All right, just be back before dark," she called back from the kitchen. Daniel hopped on his bike, pedaling towards the park. The wind was cold, biting at his cheeks, but it felt good to be moving, to have something else to focus on. He saw Marcus waiting by the basketball court, dribbling the ball. "Yo, finally," Marcus called, grinning as Daniel approached. "I thought you might be stuck in homework jail." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Almost was. Needed a break, though." They played for a while, the sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement, their laughter cutting through the cold evening air. It was simple, just shooting hoops and talking about nothing in particular, but it helped. Daniel felt some of the tension start to ease, like the weight on his shoulders was a little bit lighter. After a while, they sat down on the edge of the court, catching their breath. Marcus looked over at Daniel, his eyes curious. "So you're still getting crap from the neighbors?" Daniel sighed, nodding. "Yeah, it's like they're all mad at me for what happened with Mr. Grayson. I don't get it." Marcus shook his head, frowning. "Man, that's messed up. You saved that guy. You did something good." Daniel shrugged, picking at the edge of his shoe. "Yeah, but they don't see it that way. They think I should have stayed out of it, I guess." "Well, they're wrong," Marcus said firmly. "You did the right thing, and if they can't see that, that's their problem." Daniel looked at his friend, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Marcus, I appreciate it." Marcus grinned, nudging Daniel's shoulder. "Anytime, man. Now come on, one more game before it gets too dark." Daniel laughed, standing up. They played one more round, and by the time they were done, the sky was fading to orange, the sun dipping below the horizon. Daniel felt better, even if just a little. It was enough for now. He headed home, the air getting colder as the sun set. When he got back, his mom was in the living room, the envelope no longer on the table. She looked up, giving him a smile. "Did you have fun?" she asked. "Yeah, I did," Daniel said, kicking off his shoes. She nodded, her smile softening. "Good. You need to take time for yourself, you know." Daniel walked over, giving her a quick hug. "I know, Mom. Thanks." She hugged him back, then let him go. "All right, go wash up for dinner." Daniel headed to the bathroom, washing his hands and splashing some water on his face. He looked at himself in the mirror, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel quite so overwhelmed. The problems were still there, but maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be faced all at once. He went back to the kitchen, sitting down at the table as his mom brought over a plate of food. His dad was already there, looking tired but smiling. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the clinking of silverware. "So," his dad said after a bit, glancing at Daniel, "you think things are going to get better with the neighbors?" Daniel shrugged, taking a bite of his food. I don't know, Dad. Maybe. I just gotta keep doing what I'm doing, I guess. His dad nodded, his eyes thoughtful. You're a good kid, Daniel. Don't let anyone tell you different. Daniel looked at his dad, then his mom, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest. Maybe things weren't perfect, but he had his family, and that was enough for now. The next morning was colder than usual. Daniel zipped up his jacket all the way to his chin and adjusted his backpack filled with newspapers. The air felt sharp as it filled his lungs, and the quiet streets seemed to mirror the tension that still sat in the pit of his stomach. He stepped outside, ready to start his route. The conversation with his parents last night had helped, and so had playing basketball with Marcus, but he knew today could still be tough. He didn't expect the neighbors to change overnight. He got on his bike, pedaling slowly towards the first few houses. He delivered the first few papers with little incident, tossing them onto porches, hearing the soft thuds as they landed. Everything was quiet, almost peaceful, and for a second Daniel let himself believe that maybe today wouldn't be so bad after all. He reached Mrs. Campbell's house and paused, staring at the closed door. He took a deep breath, deciding he'd give it a try again. He stepped off his bike and walked up to the door, knocking twice. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear movement inside, the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack, and Mrs. Campbell's face appeared. She looked at Daniel, her eyes wary, then sighed and opened the door wider. "Morning, Daniel," she said, her voice flat. Daniel managed a small smile. "Morning, Mrs. Campbell. Just here to drop off the paper." She nodded, glancing down at the newspaper he held out to her. For a second she hesitated, then she took it. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now. She looked at him for a moment, and Daniel could see something in her eyes. Maybe regret, maybe something else. "Listen, Daniel," she started, then paused, like she was trying to find the right words. "About the other day, I might have been a bit harsh. I know you were just trying to help Mr. Grayson." Daniel blinked, taken by surprise. He nodded slowly. I was just doing what I thought was right. I didn't mean to make anyone upset." Mrs. Campbell sighed, her shoulders relaxing a little. I know. It's just, people don't like change, you know. We all get set in our ways. But what you did, it was brave. And I suppose I owe you an apology." Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease a little. He gave her a small smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Campbell. I appreciate it." She nodded, her face softening. "All right, well, you be careful out here. It's cold today." "Will do," Daniel said, turning back towards his bike. He felt lighter, like maybe things could get better after all. He climbed back onto his bike, pedaling down the street, feeling the cold air on his face, but it didn't sting as much today. As he moved along his route, he started to notice more people coming out of their houses. He stopped in front of Mr. Larson's house, the door already open before he even got off his bike. "Morning, Daniel," Mr. Larson said, stepping onto the porch. He gave Daniel a nod, his face looking less stern than it had the day before. "Morning, Mr. Larson," Daniel said, handing over the newspaper. Mr. Larson took it, then cleared his throat. "Listen, kid, I know I've been a bit distant. It's just, well, seeing the ambulance and everything, it shook people up. But I've been thinking, and you did a good thing. You helped Mr. Grayson when nobody else did." Daniel felt his face flush, and he looked down at the ground. "Thanks, Mr. Larson. I just did what I thought was right." Mr. Larson gave him a small smile, patting him on the shoulder. "Well, it was. And if you ever need anything, you just let me know, all right?" Daniel nodded, the weight in his chest lifting just a bit more. "Thanks, Mr. Larson. I will." He got back on his bike, feeling a sense of hope. It wasn't everyone, but maybe a few people were starting to come around. It was more than he had expected, and it made the cold morning feel a little less harsh. He continued down the street, delivering papers and feeling like, for the first time in a while, people were really seeing him. Not just as the kid who delivered their newspaper, but as someone who had done something that mattered. As he approached the end of his route, he noticed a familiar face standing in front of one of the houses. It was the young girl who lived next to Mr. Grayson. She had always watched him from her window, but today she was standing outside, her small figure bundled in a thick coat. Daniel slowed his bike, stopping in front of her. "Hey," he said, giving her a smile. "You're out early." She nodded, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice small, "for helping Mr. Grayson. My mom said you're a hero." Daniel felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, embarrassed. "I'm not a hero, I did what anyone would have done." The girl shook her head, her face serious. "No, not everyone would have done it, but you did." Daniel looked at her, his chest tightening. He nodded, his voice soft. "Thanks. That means a lot." She smiled, then turned and ran back towards her house, her mom waiting at the door. The woman gave Daniel a nod, her eyes warm, and Daniel nodded back. He rode the rest of the way home, the cold air biting at his face, but it didn't feel as sharp today. He felt like the weight he'd been carrying was finally starting to lift, bit by bit. When he got home, he found his mom in the kitchen, humming to herself as she made breakfast. She looked up when he walked in, her face lighting up. "How was the route today?" she asked. Daniel set his bag down, walking over to the table. "Better," he said, and he meant it. I think people are starting to understand." His mom smiled, coming over and giving him a hug. "I knew they would. It just takes time, sweetheart." Daniel hugged her back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Yeah, I guess so." She let go, ruffling his hair. "Now sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." Daniel sat at the table watching as his mom moved around the kitchen. His dad came in a moment later, giving Daniel a nod as he sat down. "Morning, son." "Morning, Dad." His dad looked at him for a moment, then smiled. "You look better today. Things going all right?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, things are getting better." His dad smiled, reaching over and patting Daniel's shoulder. "Good. I knew they would." As they ate breakfast, Daniel felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in days. Things weren't perfect, but they were getting better, and that was enough for now. He knew there would still be challenges, but he also knew he could face them, one day at a time. When breakfast was over, Daniel stood up, grabbing his backpack. "I'm going to head over to Marcus's for a bit," he said. His mom nodded, smiling. "All right. Be back in time for dinner." Daniel gave her a thumbs up, then headed out the door. He got on his bike, pedaling towards Marcus's house. The sky was clear, the sun shining bright, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like everything was going to be okay. He reached Marcus's house, knocking on the door. Marcus opened it, a big grin on his face. "Yo, what's up? You look like you're in a good mood." Daniel laughed, shrugging. "Yeah, I guess I am." Marcus nodded, grabbing his jacket. "Good. Let's go. I got something to show you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Marcus just grinned, pulling Daniel towards his bike. "You'll see." They rode down the street, Marcus leading the way. Daniel followed, the wind whipping through his hair, the cold air no longer biting. They reached the park, and Marcus led him towards the basketball court. Daniel stopped, frowning. "The court? What are we doing here?" Marcus pointed towards the far end of the court. Daniel looked, his eyes widening as he saw a group of kids from the neighborhood, gathered around with a basketball in hand. "We're gonna play," Marcus said, his grin widening. "And they all wanted you to come." Daniel looked at the group, recognizing some of the faces, kids he'd seen around the neighborhood, but had never really talked to. He felt his chest tighten, a mix of nerves and excitement. "Come on," Marcus said, nudging him. "It's going to be fun." Daniel took a deep breath, then nodded. "All right, let's do it." They walked over to the group, and Daniel felt a sense of hope swell in his chest. Things were changing, slowly, but they were changing, and he was ready for it. The air at the park was crisp, and the faint smell of grass hung in the cold air. The group of neighborhood kids stood at the edge of the basketball court, a mix of familiar faces and a few Daniel had only seen from a distance. Marcus led the way, his energy contagious as he jogged over, bouncing the basketball off the pavement. Daniel hung back a moment, a nervous buzz in his chest. He recognized a couple of the kids from around the neighborhood, some from the houses on his paper route, others from school. They weren't exactly his friends, but they weren't strangers either. And today, they were here for a reason. Maybe it was Marcus's doing, but maybe, just maybe, it was because things were changing, because people were starting to see him differently. "Yo, Daniel," Marcus called, waving him over. "Don't just stand there, man. Come on, we're starting." Daniel took a breath, then walked over, giving the group a small wave. One of the kids, a tall boy named Jared, tossed the ball to Daniel, giving him a nod. "Glad you're here, man," Jared said. "We need a good game. Let's see what you got." Daniel caught the ball, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He bounced it once, twice, the sound echoing across the court. He gave a nod, a small smile tugging at his lips. "All right, let's do this." They split into teams, and soon the game was underway. The ball bounced across the cracked pavement, sneakers skidding as they moved, laughter and shouts filling the air. Daniel felt the tension in his chest start to ease with each pass, each dribble. For the first time in what felt like ages, he wasn't thinking about the neighbors or Mr. Grayson or the looks people had given him. He was just here, in this moment, playing basketball. Marcus passed the ball to Daniel, and he moved quickly, dodging Jared, his heart pounding in his ears as he moved towards the hoop. He jumped, the ball leaving his fingers, spinning through the air before it swished through the net. "Yeah," Marcus shouted, clapping Daniel on the back. "That's what I'm talking about." Daniel grinned, feeling the warmth of the moment. It was just a game, just a bunch of kids on a makeshift court, but it felt like more. It felt like a step in the right direction, like he was finally breaking through the weight that had been holding him down. As the game continued, Daniel noticed a small group gathering near the court, some parents, some neighbors, watching them play. He caught sight of Mrs. Campbell among them, her eyes on him, a smile on her face. She gave him a small wave when she caught his eye, and Daniel waved back, his chest swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time: acceptance. By the time the game ended, the sun had shifted lower in the sky, a soft orange glow settling over the neighborhood. They finished up, gathering on the sidelines, out of breath but smiling. "That was great," Marcus said, high-fiving Daniel. "We got to do this more often." Jared nodded, catching his breath. "Yeah, for sure. You're good, Daniel. You should come play with us more." Daniel smiled, nodding. "Thanks. I'd like that." As the group started to disperse, Daniel saw Mrs. Campbell walking over, her face soft with a smile. "You looked good out there, Daniel," she said. "I haven't seen you boys play like that in a while." "Thanks, Mrs. Campbell," Daniel said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It felt good." She nodded, her expression turning a little more serious. "Listen, Daniel, I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. I know things have been tough lately, but you handled everything with more strength than most adults I know. You did the right thing for Mr. Grayson, and I hope you know that." Daniel swallowed, the words hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. He nodded, his voice soft. "Thanks. That means a lot." She smiled, then turned, heading back towards her house. Daniel watched her go, feeling a sense of closure. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and that was enough for now. Marcus nudged him, a grin on his face. "Dude, you got the whole neighborhood on your side now. How's it feel to be a hero?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero, man. Just trying to do the right thing." Marcus nodded, his smile softening. "Yeah, well, you did good. Don't forget that." Daniel looked around the park, seeing the familiar houses, the neighbors heading back inside as the sun dipped lower. It felt different now, less hostile, less heavy, like maybe things were finally starting to change for the better. He and Marcus grabbed their bikes, heading out of the park, the air cooling as the sun continued to set. They rode side by side, the wind in their faces, and for the first time in days, Daniel felt free. He knew things wouldn't be perfect. The struggles with his family's finances were still there, the challenges still real, but this was a start, a small step in the right direction. They reached Marcus's house, and Marcus pulled to a stop, giving Daniel a grin. "Catch you later, man. Don't forget, we're playing again tomorrow." Daniel nodded, smiling. "You got it. See you, Marcus." He watched Marcus run up to his front door, then turned and pedaled back towards his own house. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, casting a soft glow across the sidewalk. The neighborhood felt quieter now, almost peaceful. When he got home, Daniel leaned his bike against the porch and walked inside. The warmth of the house greeted him, and he could hear his mom humming in the kitchen. The smell of dinner filled the air, and he realized just how hungry he was. His mom looked up as he walked in, her face lighting up. "There you are, just in time for dinner. How was it with Marcus?" Daniel smiled, kicking off his shoes. "It was good. We played a game at the park. A bunch of the kids came." She smiled, setting a dish on the table. "That's wonderful. I'm glad you're having fun, sweetheart. You deserve it." Daniel walked over, giving her a hug. "Thanks, Mom." His dad walked in a moment later, and they all sat down to eat. The conversation flowed easily, talking about school, about Marcus, about nothing in particular. It was simple, but it was nice. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in what felt like a long time. After dinner, Daniel headed to his room, sitting down on his bed. He pulled out his notebook, glancing at the homework he still had to finish. The numbers and words didn't seem as overwhelming tonight. He picked up his pencil, taking a deep breath, and started working, the weight on his shoulders feeling lighter than it had in days. When he finished, he set his notebook aside, lying back on his bed. He stared up at the ceiling, a smile on his face. Things weren't perfect, but they were getting better, and that was enough. He had his family, his friends, and a neighborhood that was finally starting to see him for who he really was. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed. The morning sun peeked over the rooftops, filling the street with soft light. Daniel zipped up his jacket, pulled on his backpack filled with newspapers, and stepped outside. There was a lightness in his step as he walked over to his bike. Today felt different, better somehow. The cold air nipped at his cheeks, but he didn't mind. It was a new day, and he was ready to face it. He got on his bike, pedaling down the familiar streets, the weight of the newspaper bag resting comfortably on his shoulders. As he reached the first house on his route, he tossed the newspaper onto the porch, smiling at the satisfying thump it made when it landed. He kept moving, the houses passing by, one after another, and it all felt like a rhythm he could finally enjoy again. When he approached Mrs. Campbell's house, Daniel slowed down, his heart skipping a beat. She had been kinder yesterday, but he still wasn't sure what to expect. He stepped off his bike, walked up to the door, and knocked twice, waiting. The door opened a moment later, and Mrs. Campbell smiled at him, her eyes warm. "Good morning, Daniel," she said, taking the newspaper he handed to her. "Morning, Mrs. Campbell," Daniel replied, giving her a smile. It felt genuine. Easy. She paused for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. You know, Daniel, if you ever need anything, if your family needs anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're neighbors, after all. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded. Thanks, Mrs. Campbell. That means a lot. She smiled, patting his shoulder. You're a good kid, Daniel. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He nodded, his chest swelling with warmth. He turned back to his bike, feeling a renewed sense of hope. He got on and continued his route, the cold air biting at his face, but it felt invigorating now. He pedaled down the street, the neighborhood slowly waking up around him, people stepping out onto their porches, waving at him, smiling. He approached Mr. Larson's house next, and to his surprise, the door was already open. Mr. Larson stood there, waiting. He gave Daniel a nod, his expression softer than it had been in a long time. Morning, Daniel, Mr. Larson said, stepping out onto the porch. Got something for you. Daniel frowned, curious. He stepped off his bike, walking up to the porch. Mr. Larson held out a steaming mug of hot chocolate, a smile tugging at his lips. Figured it's cold out there, and you could use something to warm you up. Daniel blinked, then smiled, taking the mug. Thanks, Mr. Larson, this is really nice of you. Mr. Larson shrugged, waving his hand dismissively. It's just hot chocolate, kid, but you earned it. Daniel took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, chasing away the chill of the morning. He looked up at Mr. Larson, feeling the sincerity behind the man's words. Thanks, Daniel said again, his voice steady. Mr. Larson nodded, stepping back inside. Take care, Daniel, and if you ever need anything, you just holler. Daniel nodded, heading back to his bike, the mug in his hand. He rode slowly down the street, savoring the hot chocolate, feeling like things were finally falling into place. As he continued his route, he noticed more and more people greeting him, doors opening, neighbors waving, even a few nods from those who had once turned away. It was a small thing, but it meant everything to Daniel. It was like they were seeing him now, really seeing him. Not just as the paper boy, but as someone who was part of their community. He finished his route, the last newspaper landing with a satisfying thud on the doorstep of a familiar house. He turned his bike around, heading home. The cold air whipped around him, but he didn't mind. He felt stronger today, more sure of himself. When he got home, he found his mom in the kitchen, humming as she worked. She looked up when he walked in, her face lighting up. Morning, sweetheart. How was your route? Daniel smiled, setting the empty mug on the counter. It was good, Mom. People were nicer today. She smiled, stepping over and giving him a quick hug. That's wonderful, Daniel. I'm so proud of you. He hugged her back, the warmth of her embrace filling him up. Thanks, Mom. His dad walked in a moment later, his face lighting up when he saw Daniel. There you are. I just got some good news, his dad said, a smile spreading across his face. Daniel looked up, curious. What's that, Dad? His dad held up an envelope, his smile widening. They approved the overtime I requested. Means a bit more money coming in this month. We're going to be all right. Daniel felt his chest swell with relief. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. He gave his dad a nod, his eyes bright. That's great, Dad. His dad walked over, resting a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You've been a big help, son, with the papers, with everything. We're proud of you, and we're going to get through this together. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Thanks, Dad. His dad smiled, giving his shoulder a squeeze. All right now, why don't you take the day off? Go hang out with Marcus or something. Daniel grinned. You got it, Dad. He headed to his room, dropping his backpack on the floor and grabbing his jacket. He pulled out his phone, shooting Marcus a quick message. Hey, want to shoot some hoops? Marcus replied almost immediately. Always. Meet you at the park in 10. Daniel grabbed his basketball, heading out the door. He felt lighter today, like the weight he'd been carrying for so long had finally started to lift. He knew things weren't perfect. There were still bills to pay, still challenges to face, but he wasn't alone. He had his family, his friends, and a neighborhood that was finally starting to come around. He reached the park, seeing Marcus already there, dribbling the ball, a big grin on his face. "Yo, you're late," Marcus called, laughing. Daniel laughed, jogging over. Yeah. You ready to lose again?" Marcus grinned, tossing Daniel the ball. "Bring it on." They played for a while, the ball bouncing across the pavement, their laughter filling the air. It felt good, easy, like they didn't have a care in the world. For those moments, nothing else mattered. Just the game, the cold air, and the warmth of friendship. After a while, they sat on the edge of the court, catching their breath. Marcus looked over at Daniel, his face serious for a moment. "So, how's everything going? I mean, with the neighbors and all that?" Daniel took a deep breath, then smiled. "It's getting better. People are starting to understand, I think. It's not perfect, but it's better." Marcus nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Good. 'Cause you deserve it, man. You did something good and people should see that." Daniel looked down at his hands, feeling the warmth of Marcus's words. "Thanks, Marcus. I appreciate it." Marcus nudged him, grinning. "Anytime, bro. Now come on. Let's do another round. I'm not letting you end on a win." Daniel laughed, getting up. "You're on." They played until the sun dipped lower in the sky, the cold air turning sharper. By the time they finally stopped, they were both out of breath but smiling, their faces flushed from the cold. As they walked back to their bikes, Marcus looked over at Daniel, his voice serious. "You know, you're like the bravest person I know. Most people wouldn't have done what you did for Mr. Grayson. You stood up, even when everyone else was against you." Daniel looked at his friend, his chest tightening. He nodded, his voice soft. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot." Marcus grinned, slapping Daniel on the back. "All right, enough of that. Let's get out of here before we freeze." Daniel laughed, grabbing his bike. They rode side by side, the cold wind biting at their faces, but it felt good. It felt like freedom. When Daniel got home, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were just starting to appear in the sky. He parked his bike, stepping onto the porch. He looked around, the neighborhood quiet, a soft glow from the streetlights casting long shadows. He felt a sense of peace, a calmness that settled over him. He stepped inside, the warmth of the house welcoming him. His mom looked up from the couch, smiling. "There you are. Did you have fun?" Daniel nodded, kicking off his shoes. "Yeah, it was a good day." She nodded, her eyes soft. "I'm glad. You deserve good days, Daniel." He smiled, heading to his room. He set his basketball down, sitting on the edge of his bed. He looked around, the familiar sights of his small room, the comfort of his home. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and he was proud of the person he was becoming. The person who wasn't afraid to stand up, to do what was right, even when it was hard. He lay back, staring up at the ceiling, the sounds of his family in the other room filling the quiet. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next, ready to keep moving forward. Small steps of courage, one day at a time, and that was enough.